So I'm thrilled to have you all for our evening panel discussion. So I'm CIDO Hartogzon, if you haven't gotten that by now. And I've been involved in thinking and studying psychedelics over the past decade, and it's been my privilege to help organize this conference. And tonight we have 6 very capable panel participants. We will be speaking about the future of psychedelics and all the different questions that come up when we think about where we're at and where we're going to. We will also have time for questions from the audience, so I encourage you all to think about any questions you might have on these subjects. Also, I want to remind you another time that after the conference, we have the after party happening in Vetromano, so hope to see you there. And so I'll just already introduce 4 of our speakers here on the stage, so I'll just introduce the 2 additional speakers that joined us now. So to my left is וכטל, who's a respected veteran of the Israeli psychedelic community. And Boaz has founded the Israeli LA Rock Party, which called for legalization of cannabis, and has also been involved as an activist for the legalization and medicalization of both cannabis and ibogaine. He is the co-author of the Ibogaine Treatment Manual, written together with Howard Latzoff, and he has extensive experience working with ibogaine for the treatment of addiction with over 100 heavy drug addicts. Today, he is the executive director of Creso Pharma, an Australian public company which produces CBD-based dietary supplements. And to my right, I have Dr. Tומר Pursico, who's a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem and teaches at the Department of Comparative Religion in Tel Aviv University. His fields of study are contemporary spirituality and religiosity in Israel, and his book, The Jewish Meditative Tradition, was published in Tel Aviv University Press in 2016. He's an activist for freedom of religion in Israel, writes the most popular blog in Hebrew on religion, and has written hundreds of articles on these subjects in the popular media. So yeah, I want to start off the panel by kind of like by a quick question about where we are now. So we are at this historical moment where, thanks for the work of some of the people in this room, psychedelics seem to be just a few years away from getting approved as prescription medicines. So I want to direct these questions at all of you here, especially those involved in this process and observing it from the side. So where do we stand now at this moment, and what do you think are the barriers currently, both on the medical, legislative, and the cultural level?
Okay, well, where we're at right now is that we are engaged in discussions with the FDA, which are in a process called the Special Protocol Assessment, and it's to design the phase 3 studies that are necessary to prove safety and efficacy to make into a medicine. And so November 29th, 2016, we had what's called the end of phase 2 meeting. And phase 2 is where you do small pilot exploratory studies trying to figure out how to design phase 3. And the FDA said we had done enough of those studies, and we felt we had done enough as well, that then we could move into phase 3. And in this special protocol assessment process, you go over every detail of your study, your statistical analysis plan, and then if you come to agreement with the FDA, they say that if you prove safety and efficacy with this design, unless you find some new safety risk, they will approve the drug. And so we are now going to be May 11th, we had another meeting with the FDA. We've been engaged for 5 months in these different discussions about the protocol. That meeting was particularly important because they brought the old wise man of the FDA, a fellow named Bob Temple, who's been at the FDA since 1972. And he's their main expert on scientific methodology. And one of the big issues with psychedelics is how do you do a double-blind study? And our position is there is no solution to that. and we should just be comparing our therapy with an inactive placebo with our therapy with MDMA. And people will be able to tell the difference, but that there's no better way to do the designs than that. And so they've agreed to that. We've come to pretty much agreement, and so within the next week we're submitting the revised protocol. FDA has 45 days to review that, and we think we're going to end up with what's called an agreement letter. And then we've also been encouraged by the FDA to apply for what's called breakthrough therapy designation. And that means that this is a high priority for the FDA. It's a breakthrough for PTSD, and that they want to expedite the development through the FDA. And so now we're anticipating we can design the studies. We know more or less how many people are going to be in them. And so we're now trying to raise the 25 million. We have 10 million. And the studies that we do in Israel, the studies that we do in Canada are all part of the effort to present the data to the FDA. And then once it's approved by the FDA, we'll also go to the Ministry of Health here and the Health Canada. And then starting in August, we're going to start negotiations with the European Medicines Agency about studies throughout Europe. And that's probably going to take till the summer of 2018 to complete those negotiations, and then we'll have a better idea of what the Europeans want. And similar here in Israel, where there's a national health care, where they care about how much drugs cost in the U.S., the FDA cannot take cost into consideration. Whatever your treatment is, whatever your price is, they can't say anything about that. But where there's national health care, they want to know, is this new treatment going to be worth the money? How much better is it than an old treatment? So chances are, in Europe, we're going to have to compare MDMA-assisted psychotherapy with either an approved psychotherapy, an evidence-based psychotherapy, or Zoloft and Paxil, which are SSRIs, which are approved for PTSD. But we are now on the verge of fundamental agreements. We think the FDA will agree to breakthrough therapy. That'll be by the middle of August. And then we'll be able, I think, with these documents to raise the rest of the money. And now we're even thinking beyond European Medicines Agency. There's people who have contacted us from China who have a pharmaceutical company in China. So we're talking about eventually thinking about moving into China and elsewhere as well.
So that's a great future that we see on the medical level and on the legislative level. And I'm wondering, do you think we should be worried about maybe a cultural backlash of some kind, or are there any cultural barriers for this getting accepted into medicine and into the culture?
I think one thing I've noticed in discussions like this is that, particularly in the United States and so many other places too, where there's been either initially medical cannabis and then cannabis for regular consumption, that people go, okay, it's happening with weed, it's going to happen with mushrooms and LSD and da-da-da. And I think that definitely underestimates the amount of people who are like more or less okay with weed and are scared shitless and really disturbed by psychedelics. And MDMA is kind of it's really interesting because I think it's like a hinge, between them. And I don't consider it a psychedelic, but I'm really glad you use that word for that door opening function. But I do think that there's a lot more resistance than people in this community might feel, because it just kind of feels like, oh, we're naturally going to go move on to it. And so there has to be much more reason to do it. I think people are afraid of getting out of hand and things.
Right. So Natalie, you've been working as a policy and advocacy manager for MAPS, and you've been going through Congress and different legislative branches. So I was wondering, what's the kind of spirit or drift that you're kind of getting there? I mean, people in the psychedelic community have these kind of thoughts that the people, the powers that be, just want to use their power to repress psychedelic or anything that has to do with them and freedom. So how does that conform with your experiences? And how do you think people in government and public institutions, how do they look at these developments?
I'll say when we're speaking to them about our research, we really, I presented in a very confined medical context. I often am meeting with legislators with veterans who have been through our studies. So politicians, are open to hearing their stories of healing. So honestly, I haven't experienced very much like outright dismissal, but that also is very different than like full embrace and saying we're going to support you and help you. But I do think if we were to be presenting it in a kind of broader way, that would provoke a lot more backlash. And I do think,
And you speak about psychedelic as healing for the culture, right? Agents for cultural and social change against social injustice. So
I definitely do speak about that, and it is, strategically in different contexts I have to kind of target what I'm saying. And as you mentioned, I do really think there's a lot of potential using psychedelics to heal trauma from racism or sexism or from these systemic traumas. And that, unfortunately, is not really, my opening line when I'm meeting with Republican legislators. So I think it really just depends. But honestly, when you are able to frame it in a way that, in terms of issues that legislators care about, they really seem to be more open. And I do think it makes people feel a lot safer to have it in this medical context. We say, with our research, there are two therapists. We always make sure to say we're not giving people MDMA from the pharmacy and saying go home and good luck healing. And though we also say that there are many anecdotes of people taking MDMA at festivals and they are able to heal. So we do believe there are many other ways of using these substances to heal. But depending who you're speaking to, you have to present it in certain ways.
Right. So you've mentioned, approaching it from the medical, presenting psychedelics from the medical or from the other more social, cultural aspect. And I want to raise a topic that was that's on the minds of many people in the psychedelic community, and that was present also today throughout the day, and that's kind of like I guess something that I don't know if say polarizes, but it's a question that definitely has a host of opinions around it, and that's the medicalization of psychedelics. So on the one hand, it seems that medicalization is the way of getting these agents approved and accepted into the current legal and social frameworks. But on the other hand, it also seems that the potential of these agents is so much vaster than what medicine is interested in. So most users of psychedelics don't come to them because they have a diagnosed illness, but because they're just curious or passionate about these states of consciousness and their potential for them. So some people worry that the medical model does not encompass many of the greater potentialities of psychedelics for spirituality, creativity, enhancing relationships, self-discovery, and personal growth. So I'm wondering, I guess I would like to have like different perspectives, and we already saw different perspectives on these issues today. So do you think that the danger of medicalization might block us from really reaping the greater benefits that psychedelics might have, or blocking us from seeing these potentials in our society, or maybe we need psychedelic, we need this medical model in order to begin addressing those deeper issues?
I think there should be two models. One is the medical model, which is very valid, and it has its place, but the cognitive freedom that you talked about, which allows people to experiment under good, safe environment, is of course an option that has to be maintained, and it should not be overtaken by the medicalization movement. Ibogaine, which I don't know how many of you heard about Ibogaine? It feels like home. We tried to go to the medical way. We went to Wall Street to raise money to make Ibogaine available as a pharmaceutical. And the pharmaceutical guys told us, how many times people take Ibogaine? So we said, once, maybe twice. So we're not interested, thank you. So, and I think that's the fate that will happen to other psychedelics, when the big pharma companies will try to medicalize them, they would not see a good business model, and that is a problem. I mean, they prefer methadone, which you take daily, or adolan, as they call it in Israel. Ha'amim adolan, you must have heard this. And it's a joke. Yeah. So in the case of cannabis, which is not a psychedelic, we have succeeded to provide access to a large number of people, and there's a process of pharmatization that is happening in medical cannabis. There are medium-sized and small-sized companies coming into the space, but if they will go in the single molecule way in order to create patents, they don't go into business, these companies, unless they can make money. And they think they can make money by creating patents with single molecules or synthetic or analogs and so on. And any company that took that way to medicalize cannabis have failed. So the phytocannabinoids, as a combination of cannabinoids, is the most effective and safe way to medicalize cannabis.
I just want to add that I think in terms of medicalization, that the danger would be if we were to say these drugs are only safe in this circumstance and they should only be prescription medicines. But we're not saying that. We're also saying that these drugs should be legal for the cognitive liberty perspective. And I think that is a choice that different other groups that are trying to medicalize psilocybin are saying nothing about going beyond medicalization because they're worried about political backlash against them for talking about this bigger perspective. But we have not experienced that. So I don't feel that there's a particular danger for medicalization. I think we need to do that when there's so much misinformation about the risks of these drugs in the culture that it's hard to overcome decades and decades and billions of dollars of anti-drug education. But when you do science on medicine, on healing, we're able to get free media, incredible amounts of media that act as a new way to educate people and change their perspective. So I think medicalization will lead to legalization, and that I don't really see a harm from the dangers as you posed.
And I fully agree. So there is a relationship between the two, but coming from a medicalization model, in some ways they're separate conversations, although they're related. And I don't. Some people talk about it. Maybe I've said this even years ago, that end-of-life population is an easier way to get. That's not why the research is being done. I mean, clearly it's a decades-old path of trying to help people die with less pain and suffering. So, but I don't think it's a buffer. And I hear sometimes that lecturers, typically a young person will say to me, how come you have the keys to the candy store? How come the scientists get to do this? And where is it for the betterment for the masses? And I'm at a point where it's hard to answer the question, because I get the question, but it might be two different two conversations. But I don't think medicalization is in any way, I hope, but buffering that wider access. I think it's really two different pathways in some ways.
Tומר?
Thanks. I think I want to ask a broader question. I mean, we're talking about medicalization and whether it will harm some sort of what? Of conscious freedom, conscious liberty sort of ethos. I don't think it can really harm anything that we have not really actually defined. I mean, we have not actually defined what we want to do with these drugs. Of course, you talked about conscious liberty, and of course, nobody is going to set certain boundaries that everybody should follow and a certain path that they should go along. Obviously, people will be free to do what they want. But really, there's I don't think there's much thought given to what exactly do we want to change our consciousness to. I mean, obviously, I'm not telling anybody anything new when I'm saying that mind-transforming drugs have followed humanity since the beginning of humanity, right? There has always been sort of substances that humanity has taken in order to change its consciousness, from alcohol to whatever, right, ayahuasca. But there has always been traditions that these substances were taken in the framework of. And these traditions had some sort of ethos, some sort of ethics, some sort of path that these substances were used in order to walk along. Now, these were obviously shamanistic to religious traditions that the drugs were taking, as I said, in the framework of. And of course, we're living now without these traditions. We're in a secular world. We don't have these frameworks that give us this ethos. But I think, and of course, not saying that we need to sort of impose such a framework on everybody. Of course not, and it's not possible even if we would have wished to do so. But I don't think enough thought is given as to what direction do we want to take these sort of mind-transforming substances, right? So medicalization is an obstacle to what? To what sort of direction? What do we want to do with these drugs?
I think one way of starting to answer that question, and I suspect I am not alone in when Rick was talking about other compounds that may be medicines, and he mentioned 5-MeO-DMT, which I made a joke about. But then he said ayahuasca. And when I hear that, I go, ooh. And I go that way because there's so much investment in the religious dimension of it in both people who are interested in the traditional context and allowing indigenous groups to maintain it, in the spread of ayahuasca religions that are mestizo, like the Santo Daime throughout the globe, and then in more New Age, informal settings that still have a profound seriousness and earnestness to them that mark them as different than Burning Man or festival culture or other kinds of psychedelic use. And so I go, ooh, what is that? What is that resistance or that sense of profanation? And I think that it might be that even if we don't know why, like we don't have a clear defined goal of what that higher or not simply medical transformative path is, that the sacred that has been carved out of in the West for these substances is somehow threatened by the reframing of the material itself as a set of biologically active molecules that can be studied, broken down, et cetera, so that the response would be, from a, indigenous shamans say this all the time, say ayahuasca is not a combination of, whatever, of an MAOI and a DMT source. To say that is to not only, profane the plant, but to miss the whole cosmology. And I think that Westerners sense the ontological validity of that distinction without having the tradition to be able to really back it up. And so we have this, that I think explains the resistance. So that it's more than just we don't have a goal. What is this? How is it going to profane it? It's like no, because there is something more in the plant that is not reducible to molecules. And what is that something more? That gets tougher. But I think that the sense that there is something more in an anthropological context, we can be secular about it, or we can talk about animism and that there's a spirit of the plant, and I'm okay with that language too. That in both of those cases, there's something more that is being lost in the reframing of it.
Yeah, but let me just respond really quickly. I think that, probably you all know the Bronfman family. And so ayahuasca became legal in the United States because of Jeffrey Bronfman, the grandson. And for people in the Unyate Vegetal. So they legalized the religious use. And while the court case was going on, there was an opportunity that I presented him to Jeffrey with to do a study of the neurotoxicity of ayahuasca. This was going to be done by people who were unbiased and the National Center for Toxicological Research. And Jeffrey said no, he didn't want that done, even though that was a possible concern that the government would say it was too dangerous, because he said he wanted only the religious frame. He didn't want to take it into a scientific frame. And so I didn't go ahead with that study. So I understand those concepts, but I think that we've already ripped psilocybin away from its cultural origins as a spiritual drug by the Mazatecs, and people don't even think about that hardly anymore. I think that we can do the same. You can have respect for where things came from, but I think they're part of humanity's inheritance rather than just these indigenous peoples that originally discovered them. So I think it's appropriate to look at these drugs with respect, but we don't have to take the same setting and the same context that they've been used in before.
Just
let Tומר for a second.
Of course, we can't take the same setting. That's not even possible. But what I'm saying is that, and of course, people feel that there is something mysterious, something more, something extra, maybe even something sacred about these substances. No doubt. I mean, I saw the table selling books outside, and there's Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception next to Nisargadatta Maharaj's I Am That. So obviously, these things connect in everybody's imagination or intuition. But what I'm worried about is that if we don't talk about it, and if we don't even try to define for ourselves what path or what paths are we going to take with these drugs, we will fall back into what Western culture gives us as some sort of consciousness ethos, which is basically two things: either functionality, being awake, being in control, being sharp, being able to operate heavy machinery. Yeah, this is the Enlightenment sort of ethos, or the romantic ethos, which is being emotional and being creative and being sexual and being passionate. And these are nice things, of course, but they are not nearly enveloping or getting the potential of these substances, which is much, much more. And people will fall back on them, not given any other alternative.
Yeah.
Say a concern of mine with medicalization is who has access to the medicine. And especially when we're speaking about taking these medicines from certain cultures, many of these indigenous people don't have access to their medicine, and even when we're able to make this, an FDA-approved medicine, who's going to be able to afford it? Even in our studies, they're mostly white participants, and at least in the U.S. and around the world, people of color, suffer from trauma at incredibly high rates, and so just kind of keeping that in mind, I think, is really important.
I'd like to just maybe closing out
Yeah,
your question
please.
of medicalization as a buffer. I'd like to turn it on its head and recommend that and suggest that I think medicalization is the opposite of buffer. I think it's going to raise, a rising tide raises all boats. I think it's going to thread the needle and raise the awareness of these agents throughout the culture, as evidenced by, I think, the MDMA research and findings, psilocybin research and findings, and the positive press around it is educating the culture at large.
Right.
And I think it's actually the opposite. I think medicalization is going to increase awareness, as it is in the last 10 years. And I would suggest, and if I'm wrong, let me know if you think I'm wrong, I think the MDMA research and the psilocybin research and the press around it has greatly increased, enhanced this so-called renaissance across the cultural spectrum. So I do think it's the opposite.
Yeah. Last words, if you would.
Just to give, since we failed to go the FDA, the formal medical way with ibogaine, what happened is that today there are maybe 40 or 50 clinics around the world, most of them run by former addicts who've been treated by ibogaine. They transform their lives. So there's an alternative model in countries that have not outlawed ibogaine. So we see it's completely uncontrolled, but we try to introduce safety mechanism into this scene. That is, if you take ibogaine and you've not done screening and you have not prepared yourself, then it could be dangerous. So safety should be the common goal of everybody sitting here when they advocate the use of psychedelics, of any psychedelic. That is the quality of the experience is important, but The physical safety and the mental safety is a paramount importance of this movement.
So I want to continue on this thread of psychedelics and their potential outside of medicine. So we're currently celebrating 50 years to the Californian Summer of Love. And these days our psychedelics, as we have been speaking about the whole day, are experiencing this renaissance. But then this is happening in quite different conditions. And back in the 60s, psychedelics were seen as a radical cultural alternative that can counteract many of the ailments of modern civilizations, such as nationalism, materialism, consumerism, alienation from nature. But these days, as we've been, there's a lot of talk, of course, on the mainstreaming of psychedelics, or also trying to get away sometimes, and then getting back to maybe these more radical notions or more radical ideas. And at the same time, psychedelic culture itself has to some extent lost many of its revolutionary associations and to some extent been co-opted by mainstream culture and aesthetics and so on. And people are generally not as keen or hopeful about psychochemical revolutions maybe as they were in the 1960s when these agents were first introduced. So do you feel psychedelics still hold the same revolutionary potential for our culture? And in what way do you think it can really make a difference in this kind of grave situation that things are now at?
I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to pass the mic on, but I want to mention one thing. Maybe I'll come back to it. That 1967 was also, in many, many ways, the Madison Avenue-ation of the experience. I forget the exact date, but I think it's January of 67 was the Death of the Hippie Parade in San Francisco. So the original pioneers, including the Grateful Dead, had a parade with the coffin saying, "Don't come here, it's over." And then the so-called Summer of Love, which was very cool. I get it, And June 1st has passed, which is a great anniversary of itself in terms of Pepper being released. But a lot of it was not the original people. So
right, for sure.
But I wanted to throw that in.
The Summer of Love was no Summer of Love, but that's a different question. But the symbol remains.
Yes,
it
does.
I think psychedelics do still have a great revolutionary potential. And I know Rick and I often have a conversation because Rick prefers to call it evolutionary instead of revolutionary. But I can say what I think they're revolutionary, which is like in our MDMA for PTSD studies, part of the healing process is people moving through their fear, and instead of acting from a place of fear after their treatment, after their healing, they act from a place of love and from compassion. And I think that's ultimately the revolution that we really need. And so I don't think revolution always means this big, violent upheaval, countercultural, crazy thing, but I think it's really radically revolutionary to transform how you interact with each other and the world. So in that way, I think they're incredibly revolutionary.
Right.
One more quick thing, and I think something may be happening these days. I think a few of us have spoken about this today. And maybe response to the authoritarian winds blowing around our world, maybe there is a political and a spiritual activism utilizing, we just spoke about, more comfort with talking about love and how to treat each other, and maybe entheogens are part of that response. And that I think is interesting, and that I think psychedelics may, and I'm always ambivalent to say psychedelic culture or a psychedelic experience, because I think people there's confusion around that. But I do think psychedelics in these states of awareness, I think can be part of this incredible change happening, or seems to be happening. Something seems to be afoot. And I'm willing to admit we might be in an echo chamber of liberal progressives in Manhattan talking about this, or in Berkeley. But I do think something's happening in response to possibly what we're seeing throughout the world, and I think entheogens might have a very important role in that. So in that way, I do.
I think one of the key differences between the 60s and now is that when these drugs were sort of first entering culture and consciousness, there was a lot of unrealistic hopes that were placed on them. And it was more about the drug, and all you need to do is take the drug, and then you're going to be enlightened, and then, somehow or other you are different and fundamentally better than those people that had never taken the drug. And they ignored the set and setting, they ignored the whole process of integration, and there was this one-dose miracle cure hope. Like a lot of the early work with LSD was one dose of LSD. It wasn't like thinking about this as part of a therapeutic process, and maybe you need several experiences. So what we're doing now is talking about it more in the context of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, that one dose doesn't necessarily do it, and that there are other ways to get to these same states of consciousness without psychedelics. They're often a lot more difficult or slower. I don't think I would have succeeded in 20 years of meditation or whatever, but we're telling a different kind of a story. And the way I think of it is scouts into the future. So you can have a community and they send out scouts to see where what the terrain looks like, and then they come back and report. So they're part of the culture. Or you can have people that say, this culture I reject so much, I'm leaving it, and now I'm this counterculture. So that was the 60s. So now I think the psychedelics are part of the leading edge, looking into the future of the way we can be with each other in a more loving, more holistic ways, but we're still saying we're tethered, we're part of the culture, we're not splitting off to be something different. And I think that's why we're going to be able to make it through. And I think, just to your question, I think where we want to get to is legalization, where people can come to them through religion, through medicine, through festivals, or through any other means that they want to get pure supplies and have support of all different kinds. And that's the end goal for me, at least.
I think there's a pendulum here. There was the 60s and the counter-culture, and psychedelics was part of being against the old establishment. And now everything is almost part of the establishment. I mean, there's very little counterculture, but I'm very encouraged to see here many young researchers and young folks coming as activists into the scene. And as technology takes over our lives, there's a search for spirituality that disappeared from technologicless existence. And psychedelics is a venue to find spiritual awakening, as I see it. And I'm encouraged that entheogens, teacher plants, gain more and more respect in secular Western societies, and their role in modern consciousness will continue to evolve and play a more important role as a counter something against the expansion of the existing religions.
So I want to continue on that and the potential for spiritual revolution coming from psychedelics. And so Anthony was presenting today his study about the work with psilocybin, with the religious leaders from different traditions. And so I'm wondering about the significance that political significance that this kind of psychedelic ecumenism might have, and what kind of message these kinds of studies might bring to places such as the Middle East. And I'm also thinking about what Rick often says, that psychedelics are an antidote to fundamentalism. So I'm wondering, I'm shooting that at all of you, how does that work in your opinion, and can psychedelics be part of the answer for fundamentalism and religious strife?
My taxi ready? That's a long answer. I do think, I love the quote that I think religious experience or mystical experience is the antidote to religiosity or fundamentalism. We could be here till dawn discussing the evolution in the course of religions. The study we're doing with Hopkins, along with Hopkins, is wonderful, and really delighted and honored to be doing it. Those larger questions, I think we do. I think I hopefully will be impacted, but I do want to start in a small, more nuanced way that we're hoping to even just engage these traditions, these leaders, and have them be part of the conversation. And I have to tell you that I've been nothing but honored to have these leaders come into our study, priests, rabbis, Zen Buddhists. We hope to have imams, and across all traditions, they've been nothing but incredible and open about the genesis of religion, its intent to describe some transcendent dimension of the human experience, and of its shortcomings, of its profound shortcomings. So I hope this is an open to the conversation with them. Larger questions like solving the obviously advancements in consciousness will do things like that, but I'm not sure I'll see that in my lifetime. But yeah, that's part of the hope. But we're really happy to have them on board. We're really happy to have these studies happening. I think they're unsung heroes. I think religion gets a really bad name, and I'm one of them who talks about the incredible ills it's done over the centuries. But in a time when there was not science, that was the way to describe the ineffable. And I think there's still frameworks to connect to something, as long as we know that there are frameworks that at some point you go beyond as well. And I've spoken to some incredible leaders, including the top of many churches, the churches, and they say that, and they're wonderful about this. So it's an important conversation. I hope it makes sense.
I mean, I have to say quite bluntly, psychedelics is not any answer to fundamentalism. Not only because fundamentalist leaders and disciples will not take psychedelics. Obviously, they will not touch it, yeah? But this connects also to your last question. If there is any hope for psychedelics to be any sort of counterculture, it is in their characteristic of unpredictability. Because if psychedelics is just another instrument that we can utilize, it's just part of culture and not part of counterculture. It's part of capitalism, basically. Yeah. So if there is any potential in psychedelics to be anything other than the mainstream hyper-capitalist utilitarian culture, is in their element of surprise, unpredictability, ineffability, and so obviously they're not any sort of complete answer to anything. They can be helpful here, they can be helpful there, and we have to think about ways how to make them helpful for any sort of things. But you know, it's not any solution for anything.
One correction. I didn't say psychedelics were the antidote. Mystical experience was the antidote, not the psychedelics.
I misquoted them. My bad.
Did you say psychedelics?
I misquoted him, yeah.
So the Rick quote or the my quote is, religious experience is the antidote to fundamentalism, not the drugs.
No, yeah, okay. I mean, if you've been to a fundamentalist church where they're speaking in tongues, and it's pretty heavy. You know, they're rolling on the floor. It's, you know, you feel it. I mean, it's you can have really profound religious experience in an extremely fundamentalist context, and it's very important to remember that before Aldous Huxley, some of the most significant psychedelic thinkers in the 20th century were anti-modern right-wing. That Ernst Jünger, who was Albert Hoffman's not just his friend, but his sort of intellectual, spiritual, esoteric kind of mentor, was deeply reactionary in a fascinating way. I mean, I have a lot of respect for Jünger. You got to wrestle with him. But the idea that psychedelics necessarily lead in a progressive direction, even by facilitating mystical experience, is, you know, let's hope that it's part of our story, and then that story helps create that reality. But I think that the opposite can also be the case. I mean, there was some of you probably read, there was an interview in Reality Sandwich with a Sufi about the official fatwa that was given, the pro-ayahuasca fatwa from some cleric in Iran, and he was like a orthodox guy. I mean, it was a real fatwa, and said, okay, these things are valuable. And so I'm reading this guy, and it was really fascinating because he was seemed kind of groovy, and then I knew enough about Sufism and the traditionalism that he was drawing from, Western traditionalism as well as Islamic thought, that I could tell that he was actually just a total absolutist in the most kind of rigid way. And then he started to critique other modes of ayahuasca, and I was like, oh, wow. It just reminded me that the capacity to be absolutist and to have like the vision that is driving the whole thing, whether we talk about as inflation or whatever, but that is very much at the heart of the potential, and not in a positive way, but just just what can happen with religion and psychedelic experience. And if we imagine a situation where there's more psychedelics in many different, when there's no longer a psychedelic culture, there's many psychedelic cultures, they're more available, people are using different methods to do them, they're using them with neurotechnology to, you can go into a three-dimensional picture of a heaven and see the form and whatever. All those kinds of things that are quite easy to imagine. It's very simple to, I don't have any trouble, I don't think you have any trouble imagining forms of, let's call it fundamentalism or absolutism or whatever, that can actually use these things because they're good for programming. We look at indigenous societies and how they use psychedelics as models of healing, great, but they are also models of incorporating, inscribing social codes on young minds using the novelty. They're used in war, they're used in celebration, they're used for all sorts of reasons. It's important to recognize that the thing is really, open-ended in terms of its religious meaning. But I want to press you a little bit on this surprise thing. I think you're right on about that. And there was one part where I mentioned that the trickster side of the molecule, and that for me, a way of talking about it, and I'm interested to hear what you say, is not just that they have surprise and they're unpredictable. They throw a kind of twist or an element of chaos in it, but that chaos itself then produces a strange kind of relationship that is with something that's outside, that's unknowable, and yet there is a kind of pedagogy going on that may be invented, it may not, it's not simply a surprise, it's surprise and then there's some kind of looping process that breaks things open. So I'd like to hear that at some point.
I'll be brief.
Okay. I'll be very brief to give Boaz a chance. But I'm very glad you said that, because this is something I wanted to mention and did not mention. Psychedelics, as also mystical experiences, are always dialectical and always a dialogue. Always. You're always in a sort of intersubjective kind of path or kind of experience. It is never only you. So, and we, we can explain it in a sort of theological way, and we can explain it in a materialistic way even, maybe. But I don't know. But it's always a dialogue, and this is another reason for psychedelics not being any solution to fundamentalism, because a fundamentalist that will take a psychedelic will be in dialogue with that substance, and it's him that will be in dialogue. It's the fundamentalist. So I'm not saying change is not possible, but we have to, and of course you all know this. You all notice that it's very much concerned about how you are approaching who you are that is taking the substance.
Just a quick, I wrote something a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago. Allow me a couple of quick paragraphs. Denying people legal access to entheogens can be explained maybe with a desire of governments to monopolize the consciousness of people, so behavior of the masses can be predicted under conditions of control. Monotheistic religions' instincts to suppress competition, monotheistic religious instincts to suppress competition, and the strength of their opposition to non-abstinence-based faith certainly influenced the will of governments to allow sacred plants and science. Ibogaine-related research stands out as an entheogen's history because its efficacy, especially for the anti-addiction indication, has been scientifically measured both in animals and in humans. Freeing the Western mind from government's media-controlled and dictated consciousness and from the side effects of the toxic legal and illegal drug industries is a task in hand. Imported entheogens or plant teachers are viewed as a threat by the American formulated UN drug conventions because they promote peace, communal and personal awakening and the preservation of nature. These traits directly conflict with economic forces benefiting from Western governments' love affair with abstinence-based monotheistic belief systems, endless industrial growth, and the preservation of the prison industrial complex.
Arik, yeah, let's go with that.
So I responded, there's no one magic bullet. So I think when we look at the larger content, the larger settings that you were talking about, if you look at the ayahuasca churches, they have mystical experiences, but they're homophobic, they're patriarchal, so it doesn't automatically resolve all the issues of the cultural context that you use it in, but it opens people up and gives them the possibility of change. So I think if we look down at the syncretic churches in Brazil and Peru, that they're sort of began from the Catholic Church, and then they kind of had to live in that context with the Inquisition, and then bring in these tools that create mystical experiences. So they open people up, and they don't do it automatically all by themselves, but I think that over time they will do that. And we see in the U.S. the ayahuasca churches, initially they stayed the same as the Brazilian churches in order to get legal protection, but now they're also evolving. And so I think that this idea that mysticism is the antidote to fundamentalism, I've seen that work in incomplete and partial ways, but also in some ways where people, we saw it actually with, in the Trip of Compassion, who is, from a very religious family, now says he's spiritual but not religious. And so I think if we can somehow or other help people who are fundamentalists, who are holding on rigidly to a dogma, to see that if they let go of that, they're not nowhere, that they might actually have this deeper spirituality that's something that then they can use to reinvigorate their own traditions. It doesn't mean that people have to leave their traditions behind. And I think that's the scary part for these religious traditions. If they let go, then are these traditions just going to fall apart? And I think you can see through a mystical perspective how to reinvigorate and re-enliven the traditions.
So, thank you. So it's getting late, and I want to open this to questions from the audience. If there's any, yeah, please.
Shall I repeat the question?
Excuse me?
Shall I repeat?
Yes. Oh, okay.
He asked, if we're talking about the goals of psychedelics, isn't the very act of breaking boundaries of nationality and race and gender while taking psychedelics a legitimate goal or a definite goal? Well, it's a goal, but it's simply the sort of hyper-liberal goal. It's not specifically connected to psychedelics. This is radical leftist ethos. Yeah, it's nice. You can be a part of it, but it's not. You can have psychedelics help you maybe do it, but it's not any traditional ethos of consciousness.
No, but it's deeply rooted in the psychedelic thought.
Perhaps in the Western liberal psychedelic thought, not in ayahuasca churches,
yeah,
right?
Okay, so I'm talking psychedelic thought is Western psychedelic thought.
Yeah. Okay. But then you're dismissing all traditional use of these sort of substances, which had other goals, like, let's say, losing the ego or uniting with existence. These are goals. Or having visions of angels. These are also goals that were there. People use these substances for these things. Now, we want to say, oh, that's all bullshit. That's a part of the past. We are going somewhere else. Okay. But know that you are changing something fundamental, and you are constructing a new ethos for what you are going to do with these substances. Now, not enough thought, is what I'm saying, is dedicated to articulating these things.
More questions? Baksha?
Hi. First of all, it's been a real pleasure hearing all of you here. Thank you. Ibogaine was mentioned several times here, and I feel it's like a special compound or drug, because in contrast to all other substances that we research, it does not have a real history of abuse or any recreational use. So don't you think it's going to be easier to advance legalization or political
Ibogaine was banned in the United States the same day that LSD was banned.
Because it's an analog, yeah, but was it ever a problem?
What? To work with an illegal substance, to medicalize illegal substance is very difficult. It's much more difficult.
I mean, was there ever a cultural or popular... No, nobody knows about it. There are no incidents of known Ibogaine abuse. And now the world is opening up to... there's MDMA research, psilocybin research, which are demonized substances. And Ibogaine is not. So why is it not... Do you think it's easier to legalize it, at least in a...
It's not easier. Actually, more countries ban Ibogaine, including Israel, in the last few years. And the Ibogaine movement, which started in the Lower East Side in Manhattan, which I was part of the 4 people who worked with Howard Latzov, is splintered around the world. And there's no leadership. Howard Latzov, the gentleman who was a heroin addict and came across Ibogaine that cured him from his addiction, he died. And we tried to organize a movement for the purposes that you're talking about, to legalize it. But it has also, it's an African shrub, and so due to racist reasons, many times we say, oh, it's from Africa, we are not into it, you know. So there are many reasons why people object to Ibogaine. In the Ibogaine movement, we called it, it's not a classic psychedelic, it's remogenic drug. Because when it releases suppressed memories in a visualized form with no distortion, yes? But it didn't help us legalize cannabis. But in countries where Ibogaine is not regulated, like in Mexico and in many other countries, there's a huge scene of people coming, for example, from the United States to detox on opiate pain medications in the 40 or 30 clinics that exist in Mexico. And it's spreading in South Africa, in Canada, and so on. So it's spreading uncontrollably, and we try to introduce safety mechanisms in this process, but we were not able to either legalize it or medicalize it, as we've done with medical cannabis, for example.
So there's not a strong enough lobby for Ibogaine.
So I'm actually starting to build a campaign more to lobby for Ibogaine, and it's something we're working a lot on. And actually what you're saying really, we're finding to be true, that people have no idea what Ibogaine is. So unlike LSD or MDMA, where people have some preconceived notions, they are a bit more open. And right now in the U.S., there's a horrible opiate crisis. 90 people, 90, are dying every day from opiate overdose. So people are a bit more open. Though there isn't a history of Ibogaine abuse, Ibogaine is more dangerous. There are deaths associated with Ibogaine, so that is something that is a very real concern and kind of one of the biggest things we're trying to confront. Also because Ibogaine is a very big experience in a lot of ways. It's a bit more difficult to, medicalize or kind of introduce in our current systems, but there's research being done right now that's Ibogaine, like titrated doses, so instead of one big dose.
It's somewhat comparable to ayahuasca, maybe longer in duration, but...
We had a guy who took Ibogaine, it was a methadone addict.
Rick, do you want to just say...
and he said taking Ibogaine is like 1,000 hits of acid, okay? So it's a class by itself, Ibogaine. and it's really profound, and it's very constructive and transformative, but it's not euphoric, okay?
Okay, one last question.
All right.
Yeah,
I was going to
please.
very quickly let me answer you. So the fact that ibogaine doesn't have a history of abuse wouldn't make it any easier to get approved, because it's considered Schedule 1 and it's considered a psychedelic, and we're not having any particular problems now with LSD or psilocybin, which also do have histories of abuse. One of the things that really sunk ibogaine in the early years was the for-profit model, where people started suing each other about the imaginary profits that they were going to be making. And so what's really happened for us now is that the patents, the use patents, have expired. So now it's in the public domain, the use for addiction. And so I think it's possible to bring both either for-profit or non-profit into developing ibogaine. And I think it's one of the top priorities that should be developed. But I don't think that it's got any special advantage that we can use because it's not being abused at the moment.
To put the historical record, to put the history in place, Howard Lutzow tried to go not-for-profit way. He failed. He tried to go the profit way, the for-profit way. He failed. So either way, or it didn't work to legalize it because the business model for the pharmaceutical industry was not there. They didn't show any interest.
I would say, sorry, one more quick thing about ibogaine, that it actually, we were talking about it being illegal in many countries, but actually it's only criminalized in a few countries, and the UN conventions does not criminalize ibogaine. So.
Okay, yeah, please.
So I know it's really late, but I wanted to ask you something about the body, because it's been a really long day, and we've all been talking about the mind, and about clinical research in psychology and psychiatry and different pathologies or whatever diagnosis we have. And almost none of us had embodied or in any way brought into this discussion the central role of the body. Maybe my feminine identity, maybe, I don't know, me working as a body therapist, but I find it very strange that all of our discussion, and I find it again and again in the psychedelic discussion, is so centralized about from here up, and we have almost certainly not an embodied discussion, something that actually involves the body, but also not even a theoretical discussion about the role of the body, of the physical transformation that takes place during the experience, the forms of trance that we heard about today, and the forms of healing that does not take place only when a person just lie there and still, but when the body is responding and things are happening through this works of these different molecules. So I would be happy to hear something about that.
We are all pro-body here.
I don't think you meant this. I think I'm answering the wrong question. But in terms of body, I will say I think there's a lot of potential for use with disorders that involve the body. And I don't think you meant that. Did you mean whatever? But I think you meant something more positive about the body being active and engaged in a process. But I'm fascinated by, I used to treat for years, and I ran a clinic with chronic fatigue syndrome and various somatic disorders, and chronic pain that has no real underlying continuing function beside an initial injury 30 years ago. And and I think psychedelics have a potential, a big role in working with body, anorexia, eating disorders, body image. And I think in that way, I think is something I've been interested in doing in terms of these really refractory, complex disorders, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, all that involve body components that we know very little about, and there are no models that really work. I mean, neurology, all these Neurontin, some of these medicines are just, so that's one thing. But I don't know if you meant that, but dance. The body dances when it's on LSD. There's a good body part. It could dance for 10 hours. And back to Grateful Dead. 30 years of dancing.
Sorry? Well, just just in the therapeutic method. So we encourage people to let out through the body, through shaking or through screaming or through crying, so that it's not only an analytical discussion. And a lot of times people who have ideas or things that are difficult for them express it first in nonverbal ways through their body. And so that's why we encourage people to let the energies be in their body, and then often from that it emerges the story. So just as a brief example, one time I was working with somebody who his arm became paralyzed. This was under the influence of MDMA. And he couldn't move it. And we knew that MDMA does not hurt your nerves that way. And over several hours, the story emerged about how he was a doctor and his family had gathered around his father who was dying, and they decided that they would stop life support, and he was the one that actually had to make that order and pull the plug. And then it turned out that he hated his father, and so he was conflicted that he caused his death. And then as he started telling the story and separating out that really he was doing what his mother wanted, he was doing what his father wanted, he was doing what the rest of the siblings wanted, he kind of was able to, in a sense, forgive himself, and then his feeling came back to his hand, and he was no longer paralyzed. So that happens a lot through the mind-body connection. So it's a very important part of the therapy, even though we didn't talk about it that much.
Just to go back to ibogaine example, it has a metabolite that is secreted in fat cells that has a slow release, which lasts 6 months, and is very powerful antidepressant. When you treat drug addicts and they kick their habit, you find the underlying, psychodynamics, which is usually very depressive. I mean, they suffer from depression, and so the body-mind interaction is very important. The pharmacology of it with the body influences the mind, and ibogaine is especially.
Natalie, if you want to have the closing word on that.
Well, I was going to say that I think the mind-body connection created from psychedelic experiences are also part of the revolutionary nature of psychedelics, kind of back to that concept that is what's so, mind-altering, to kind of connect and understand where you can store things in your body and that it's not separate. So I do think that's a really important part of that.
I'm not going to answer your question again with the wrong answer, but I'm very tired. But one body piece is interesting with dying patients, and I think I mentioned it today in the lecture, that people have the insight we're not just these bodies. As glorious as they are in so many ways, the ability to connect with part of ourselves that might not be just a body is such a gift for someone whose body is failing. So, again, I probably didn't answer the way you meant it, but I'm ready for sleep.
Okay, yeah, so it is getting rather late, and I personally feel the need to move my body in the tether. So thank you for all the participants that were here with us. Thank you all for coming to this conference and sharing this day with us. Thank you.
And let's thank Ido for this wonderful conference.
Thank you.
Take a picture?
Oh, yeah.